Welcome back to Inspirathon 23. Our next speaker is Shane Hatton. Shane spent the last decade developing remarkable leaders, teams, and cultures all across the world. He's an expert in leader communication, blending his experience in business and psychology to help leaders communicate, connect, and collaborate more effectively in order to bring about the best in all of us. Shane is passionate about helping leaders have the conversations they need to create the teams they want, and is a master of bringing simplicity to the complex. As a speaker, coach, and trainer, Shane is partnered with some of Australia's most well-known and loved businesses across the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. And his work can be found in publications like the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, The Australian, and more. He's a Gallup certified strength coach and author of 2 books, including Let's Talk Culture, The Conversations You Need to Create the Team You Want, and Lead the Room, Communicate a Message that Counts in Moments that Matter. In Shane's talk, he'll explore the findings from an extensive culture study in Australia's leading workplaces and reveal the 5 practical conversations you need to have to create the team and culture you want. You can imagine myself from the Culture Institute. I'm incredibly interested to hear what Shane has to say. Welcome, Shane.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
No, it is a fascinating initiative, isn't it? I've known Matt Manners for longer than I'd like to admit, and the fact that he's doing this is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, 24 hours. I posted on LinkedIn saying that I was speaking at a 24-hour event, and they asked me how I was going to come up with 24 hours of content. Thank goodness it's not just me speaking for the 24 hours.
It's a great question. 20 minutes is hard enough.
It's true. It's very true.
Well, look, I'll leave you to it. Look forward to hearing what you've got to share with us today.
Thank you so much, and great to see everybody through the camera lens wherever you are in the world. Looking forward to going on a conversation and a bit of a journey about culture. And I know that there is a common thread of culture that has already been woven through the speakers before me and will continue to be woven through after me. I get the privilege of being able to travel around the world and talk about the thing that I love, which is team culture. And there's one thing that I've learned no matter where I go in the world, and it's this one thing that is common across countries, across organizations, across people that I meet, and it's this one simple idea, is that we are all just a little bit weird. That's the thing that I've realized. No matter where I go, we're all a little bit weird. And if you don't realize that about yourself yet, hopefully by the end of this conversation, you're going to realize that. Now, I don't mean to say weird in any kind of offensive way. I say it in an endearing and an affectionate way, that we're all a little bit different. I had this sudden realization back when I first got married, and I'd met my wife. We've been married now for 15 years. But I remember meeting her for the very first time and having the opportunity to move in together. And we bought our very first home, and we were living together. And there was a moment when we kind of arrived in our house for the very first time, and I started laying towels down at the doorways to all the entrances in our house, that my wife it piqued her interest as to why. And you're probably wondering the same thing right now. So let me rewind the clock a little bit and help you understand. So I grew up in Queensland. I grew up in the northern part of Queensland, up in a place called Bundaberg that you may know for Bundaberg rum. You might know it for its Bundaberg ginger beer. But ultimately, I grew up in a very hot and humid climate. And so coming home at the end of the day, my stepdad was a very clean person. And so he had this belief that when you would come home at the end of the day and you'd been out in the heat and, we were teenage boys, my brother and I, he believed that when you came home, you would bring all the oil and the sweat underneath your feet into our house and it would ruin our carpet. Now, in his defense, we never replaced a single thing in our life, but there was this feeling that everything, it needed to be clean and neat and tidy. And so when we would arrive home at the end of the day, we would go outside and there would be a bar of soap sitting next to the hose, next to the faucet, and we would wash our feet with a bar of soap. So naturally, when you would walk inside the door, there would be a towel at the entryway to the door of our house. So fast forward to getting married and moving in with my wife for the very first time. And she comes home at the end of the day after a day in the heat and just walks inside our house like some kind of animal without washing her feet. And I am absolutely mortified by this decision that she's made. At the same time, she's looking out into the backyard, watching me wash my feet with a bar of soap, thinking to herself, who have I married? I've married some kind of psychopath. And we had this sudden realization that we were both just a little bit weird. We were both just a little bit different. And we now had to try to figure out how on earth we were going to work together and how we were going to live together. And it required us to have a really honest conversation with each other. One of my favorite quotes is this quote by Carl Christian Flores. It says, there's two types of people. The first are people that think they're two types of people. The second are those who've accepted that everyone is tragically and gloriously different. When we think about our differences, there is a tendency for us to believe that it's our differences that separate us, that make us unusual or weird, or that cause us not to belong. And I want to suggest to you today that it's our differences that actually make our organizations better. When we learn to embrace that every person is uniquely and gloriously different, we can create organizations that are innovative, creative, and impactful. But if you're like me, and you've realized this sudden moment where we go, oh my gosh, we're so different to people around us, we've got to try and find a way to make these differences work at work. And I want to suggest today that culture and team culture is the key to making our differences work at work. We embarked on a research project about a year and a half ago now in Australia, where we studied 1,000 Australian managers to try and better understand this big idea and concept called culture. And we asked a series of questions, and they were natural questions to ask. The first question we asked is, does culture really matter? Does culture make a difference? Is culture really that important? 99% of the people we studied, of 1,000 Australian middle managers, told us that they believe culture is critical to the overall success of an organization. So we asked them, in what ways does culture influence and impact a business? And these are some of the areas they told us. They said it shows up in employee engagement, inclusion and diversity, psychological safety, staff attraction and retention, achievement of organizational goals, creativity and innovation, physical safety, revenue and profit. All of the areas that are critical to the success of an organization are influenced and impacted by your team culture and your organization's culture. So there was no arguing that, culture was important. So the next question we asked them, well, do you know what culture is? Can you define culture? And 97% of Australian managers said they have a clear understanding of what culture is. 0.1% said, oh, I'm not really sure. I've got no idea at all. So naturally, then what do you think the next question we asked them was? Well, how do you define organizational team culture? And that's where things got interesting. We had all different kinds of responses from people. They said things like, we're inclusive and we're supportive and we work together to get the job done. They said things like, it's the atmosphere of an organization. It's the vibe. They said things like good, which was very confusing. I didn't really fully understand what people meant by this, but there were a lot of people and responses of people who said good. But this is the most interesting definition that people came up with. They said organizational culture is the collection of values, expectations, and practices that guide and inform the actions of all team members. Now, I saw that definition. I thought, that's a good definition. I almost thought it's kind of a little bit too good. 1 in 10 people gave us this definition of culture. It was the most consistent definition of culture that existed. And I had a moment where I thought to myself, if I had said that I knew what culture was, and then in the next question was asked to define culture, what would I do if I didn't know the answer? So I opened up a new tab on Google and I typed into Google, define organizational and team culture. And do you want to know what the definition was? It was this one right here. And what we learned about culture and people's understanding of culture is that even though people say they know what culture is, only 1 in 10 people could actually give us some kind of consistent answer. And most of those people Googled the answer to that. And what it taught us about culture is this big idea that culture is really easy to describe, but it's hard to define. And I've heard a couple of people talk about culture so far to try and understand and bring definition to culture. And it's actually quite complex and it's really hard to define culture. And one of the big reasons it's so hard to define is because as of now, there really is no universal definition of culture. If you go back and look through some of the previous studies around culture and different definitions of culture, I think I found about 54 different academic definitions of culture. And as we were looking through these definitions, we started to notice these definitions have things in common. And I want to give you 4 really quick elements to understand culture, because once we understand the elements of culture, we know what we can do about culture. And I think the most important thing is not that we get caught up arguing about the definition of culture, but rather we know how to actually apply culture, shape culture, and change culture. And so I want to give you 4 elements that I found that exist in every definition of culture. The first is every definition of culture that we found involves some kind of collective element. And what we mean by that is that they talked about things like shared norms, members, organizations, and assumptions. It was always referring to something in a collective sense, which meant that it wasn't that I had culture and you had culture, but when we came together, we had culture. And what it also means is that wherever you have a team, you have a culture, whether it's by design or whether it's by default, whether it's by chance or whether it's by choice, your team has a culture already. The second thing we learned about culture is that it always has some unseen element to it. They said things like values and beliefs, understandings and meanings. Now, if I was to get you wherever you are, maybe you're driving a car, maybe you're sitting in front of your laptop, maybe you've got me in your ears right now, to just hold a finger out in front of you for a moment and just point to the sky. Now, if I was to ask you on the count to three to point in a direction, I want you to just do that. Again, you might look silly in your office, you might look silly in your walk, but just go with it. All right, on the count of three, I want you to point to your values. 1, 2, 3. Where are you pointing right now? Are you pointing to your heart? Are you in the office? Are you pointing to the values that are written on the wall? Are you pointing to a website? Are you pointing to your stomach? Where are you pointing right now? Or if I was to do this again, I was to ask you to point to your beliefs. Where would you point? Maybe to your brain, maybe to somewhere else. The question is, if do your beliefs and do your values influence your culture and the way that you show up to work every single day? Absolutely. But can you touch them and can you point to them? No, not at all. There are some kind of unseen elements to culture which are shaping our cultures within our organizations, but we can't always see them. The third thing is that there's always a collective and observable element. So there were words like sets of behaviors, systems, practices, patterns, and ways. And what this referred to is probably what most people talk about with culture, which is some kind of observable behavioral norms. So it shows up in your policies and your practices and your systems, but it shows up in your day-to-day behaviors. So there's an observable element to culture. And the final element is that there is a shared learning element to culture. They used words like shared and learning. And so if we take these elements of culture to try and understand what culture is, we know the levers that we can use to shape culture by design. And so if we look at this and think about how culture shows up, when we enter into a team, when we're discovering a new team, we show up and start to try and learn. We learn about the culture of the team from other people. Well, how do we do that? Well, we take note of the things that we can observe, the behaviors, the systems, the practices, the patterns, and we use that information to try and make sense of what we can't see, the values, the beliefs, the understandings, the meaning, what's important to these people. And we use that information to adjust our own behaviors to be able to fit within the collective. We want to ultimately belong within a team. And when we can adjust our behaviors to adapt and to fit in within a collective norm, we feel like we can belong. And so once we understand these definitions of culture, now we can have this understanding of what do we do to shape culture by design? How do we take those elements and actually make culture pragmatic? I would suggest one of the biggest challenges with culture is that we talk about culture. We talk about it as an abstract concept or an idea that often comes across really fluffy. But I think culture is ultra pragmatic, and it's something that every single team member and team leader can do. And so I want to look really quickly at 5 conversations that will help hopefully bring some understanding about how we can make culture a little bit more practical. The first conversation I want to look at is what I call the expectation conversation. If you think about your biggest frustrations and disappointments and tensions that exist within your organization, I would suggest that they can be traced back to a misalignment of expectations. If you think about this quote, I really love it. It's by Toria Leto, a New York-based psychologist, and she said this. She said, "What isn't communicated is felt. What's felt is interpreted, and what's interpreted is often inaccurate." Expectations are like an invisible rule book that we carry around day to day. We use it to judge other people by, we use it to hold standards to for ourselves, and we use it to try and make sense of the world around us. Usually there's 3 big sets of expectations: expectations of what we expect of ourselves, expectations that we have of others, and expectations of the world at large. And those expectations are an invisible rulebook that other people can't see. So when you show up into a team, what we're doing is we're finding these collision of invisible rulebooks. Think about an example. There was a person that I was talking to at a conference once, and I said, "What are some of the expectations that you have of people on your team?" And she was a receptionist, and she said, "Well, I kind of expect that when a person goes to the morning tea room to make themselves a cup of tea, that they'd also make me one at the same time." And I said, well, what's that about for you? And she said, I think it's about collaboration, which is the most unique application of collaboration I think I've ever heard. But I thought about being in that scenario. There's an expectation that she's holding of people that they don't know is an expectation. And so every single day, a person walks past to the morning tea room and goes to make themselves a cup of tea, walks past without one. She's sitting there stewing, frustrated, angry that people aren't making her a cup of tea, not realizing that there's a misalignment of expectations. When it comes to creating culture, we have to start the conversation with what do we expect of one another on this team? And in doing so, what we do is make the unspoken spoken. It's a way of making those unspoken expectations of one another really explicit. And there's 3 questions that you can ask of your team, which will help do this. The first is, as a leader, what do I expect of you as a team member? The second, as a team member, what do you expect of me and of the other people on this team? And the third is, what does our organization collectively expect of us? And as you start to have these conversations, you'll begin to notice there are certain themes that emerge. Every single time I work with a team and we pull these expectations together, we start to notice that woven through all of these expectations is a set of core themes. And those core themes are the themes that can really unite a team. Call them values if you'd like to, call them themes if you'd like to, call them, anything you'd like. But I think what you'll find is that there's things that we have in common. And when we identify those things in common, we have a direction in which we can walk. Now, the second conversation I want to touch on is what I call the clarification conversation. Once we've had a conversation about expectations, we can't just stay with expectations. One of the biggest criticisms of values or these themes is that often values are too abstract. And the reality is that values should be abstract. The reason why they need to be abstract is because they need to be abstract enough to include multiple sets of behaviors and multiple groups of people. If our values are too specific, we exclude people. The challenge with values being so abstract is that they often become impractical, or people struggle to articulate what they actually look like to live them out. And so the clarification conversation is about being able to define the behaviors that demonstrate what these themes or these values look like every single day for people. It's helping people understand what good looks like. If I was to ask you today to go out and be optimistic, if you wanted to create an optimistic culture, and I told your team to go be optimistic, what would you do? What's the first thing that you would do? If I told you right now, I want you to go and be innovative or create an innovative culture, what's the very first thing that you would do? These questions are important because the reality is everybody's going to answer that question very different. So if we've got different people answering a question in a different way, prioritizing different behaviors, we're not going to create a collective behavioral norm. And so what we need to do is find common understanding. And I call it walking around the dice. And this came from a conversation we had with a great thought leader by the name of Holly Ransom. She wrote a great book called The Leading Edge. And she tells a story about meeting with her mentor. And in that meeting with her mentor, he comes and he rolls a set of dice on the table and he says, Holly, what do you see? And she said, well, I see a couple of dice. He said, no, I want you to be really specific. And she said, well, I see, a couple of dice. I see a 6 and I see a 5. And he said, Holly, well, I see a 1 and I see a 4. So which one of us is right? And she said, well, I guess we both are. And it was the words that he said, which I have really stuck with me, which is, he said, Holly, just because your perspective is right doesn't mean it's the only one. When it comes to identifying the behaviors that show people what good looks like, we have a perspective, but we need to walk around the dice and understand other people's perspective so that we can fully appreciate what does this culture look like to live it out every single day. Great communication isn't just an exchange of words. It's a transfer of meaning. We want to know, what does it mean to do this every single day? And in doing so, we make the invisible observable. We take a value, we take our culture, we take the unseen elements of culture, and we make it observable for people. All right. The third conversation I want to look at is what I call the communication conversation. I think the communication conversation is one of the most overlooked conversations. There is a guy, his name is Nigel Richards. This is him here. If you're a Scrabble player, you may know him. If you're not, let me tell you about Nigel Richards. He is what they consider the GOAT of Scrabble. And what we mean by the GOAT of Scrabble means that he's the greatest of all time. He's won 5 world championships. Most other people have only won at most 1. He's won 5. He's New Zealand born, living in America. Now, in 2015, he competed in the World Championships in France, and it was essentially the French Open for Scrabble. And the entire game was played in French. Nigel participated in this tournament because he spent 9 weeks memorizing the French dictionary. He was so good to the point where he was able to correct French players on their words. The funniest part of this story is that once Nigel had won this tournament, he went out to deliver a press conference. And during the press conference, he needed a translator because he couldn't speak French. I think there's a difference between knowing the words and speaking the language. And I think when it comes to culture, it's one thing to have our values written on a wall. It's one thing to have experiences where people, can recite some of the things that are written in a playbook or a strategic plan. But it's another thing to embed it as part of your everyday language as a team. One of the stats from our research was that only 1/3 of people leaders saw shared organizational language as an important and ingredient of healthy culture. And I would suggest we're missing a really crucial opportunity here. A really simple example of this language is something when you see, if you've ever been in an airport, you've been delayed, you'll hear flight staff come out and they'll say, "We're really sorry about the delay, but we care about safety over schedule." Something as simple as safety over schedule is a shared common language that helps articulate a culture of safety. And it's empowering for people to have language to be able to talk about a culture in a way that's memorable and that's meaningful for people. We call them team memes. What are the team memes that you have? What are the phrases and the language and the stories that you tell that help articulate and demonstrate your culture? That's part of the communication conversation. And it's all about making the words a language. All right. The last 2 conversations I want to bring together are what I call a left and right hook. The left hook is what I call the confrontation conversation. I think when it comes to culture, there's this great quote by Todd Whitaker and Steve Gurnett, which says, "The culture of any organization is shaped by the worst behavior the leader is willing to tolerate." I think that's such a profound idea. I think when we're going to shape culture, we shape it in 2 ways. We shape it by the behaviors that we're not willing to tolerate, the behaviors that we challenge, and we shape it by the behaviors that we celebrate and that we recognize and that we reward. And so what's a simple way to challenge a behavior that's not aligned with the culture that you're trying to create? I have 3 really simple ideas for you. And I talk about it as an observation, an impact, and an input. And it sounds something like this. Hey, I noticed this. I noticed this behavior. The second is the impact of that. Well, what that meant was, and the third thing is, what are your thoughts about that? Hey, I noticed during our last meeting, Shane, you seemed a little bit distracted and you're on your laptop a lot. And the impact of that was we didn't get to hear much of your voice into this conversation. And as a result, we really are not creating the kind of collaborative culture that we said we wanted to create together. What do you think about that? What are your thoughts? Is there something I'm not seeing? Asking these 3 questions can bring intentionality around addressing cultural misalignment. And when we start to do this over and over again, we start to make feedback less difficult. The final conversation that I want to leave you with is what I call the celebration conversation. The celebration conversation is a lot more fun than the confrontation conversation. Nearly half of the Australian leaders in our survey said that a lack of reward and recognition contributes to an unhealthy culture within an organization. Nearly half of the people told us that, hey, when we're not feeling rewarded and recognized for our work, we feel like it's contributing to an unhealthy culture. Whatever you celebrate and whatever you reward and recognize, people will do more of. So if you're looking to shape a culture by design, identify the behaviors that you want to see replicated and intentionally go after and celebrate those behaviors. Ken Blanchard, the 1 Minute Manager, calls it catching someone doing something right. We often try to look for opportunities to catch people doing something wrong. I think it's an opportunity to catch people doing something right. But the key in recognition is not just catching them doing something right. It's meaningfully recognizing and rewarding that. And I ran it through these 4 questions. Is it specific? Be just as specific in the recognition as you would be in your criticism. The second, is it meaningful? Did you tell them why it really mattered to you? The third thing is it intentional? Have you been able to link that specific behavior with the culture that you're trying to create? And the final is it personal? Is it delivered in a way that's actually meaningful to the person? As we start to develop this ongoing practice of recognition, I think that's how we make recognition more meaningful. So as I bring this into close, I want to leave you with one big idea, and then I want to recap the 5 conversations to make sense and to really reinforce this conversation today. Here's the big idea I want to leave you with. You can't influence where the culture exists. It already exists within your team, but you can influence what kind of culture exists. You can't influence where the culture exists, but you can influence what kind of culture exists. And if you're watching the recording and you want to take a screenshot, here are the 5 conversations that we walked through. Number 1, start with a conversation about expectations. What do we expect of one another on this team? Identify the core themes that exist within those conversations, and then ask yourself, what would this look like in practical, everyday, observable behaviors? What are the things that we can prioritize that would help shape that kind of culture? Thirdly, how do we craft some language and some memes and some stories that help us talk about it in everyday language rather than something which is too abstract or words that we probably wouldn't even use? And then finally, how do we confront when we're not living out those behaviors? And finally, how do we celebrate when we see those behaviors in action? I think in doing that, we've got a really practical framework from taking culture, which is something which is really abstract, to something which is very practical and tangible. So with that, thank you so much for joining me. Thanks so much for your time. I'm going to, Oh, I can't hear you.
That's because
There we go.
Thanks so much for your presentation. That was incredibly interesting. I think I spent 25 years studying culture, and you seem to be adding to my knowledge. So I was really appreciated that personally. I'm sure all listeners would have found that
That's very
incredibly
kind.
valuable. I do have a couple of questions for you, which are tricky ones, and you, as a practitioner, you'd understand this as well. You mentioned in your talk, and it's a really topical element, which is you want people to talk about culture in lots of organizations, particularly large companies. And if you ever do any work in the higher education sector, this is very, very pertinent. They don't want to talk about culture. It's a dirty word. As soon as you say culture, they think of balloons and fluff. How do we get around that?
Yeah, great question. I think the challenge is because it's like using the word empathy. When we use that word empathy, everyone goes, "Oh, soft, fluffy." It's it's all those things. And so there's a branding issue as opposed to an empathy issue. It's the same with culture. Culture has a brand and a reputation problem that just needs some management. And so when you're bringing the culture conversation, is helping people understand that it's rooted in very pragmatic, practical things that make people's life better. And so I think as the practitioner and the person who's driving that change, you have to draw the line of sight between the actual business outcomes, not just the feeling or the emotive outcomes that as a result of culture. It has very pragmatic results for the business.
Thank you. I think that's a great answer. Can I ask you a personal question? How old are you?
Please. I am 35.
Okay, so you're in this in-between sort of stage where a lot of the leaders are still 55, 60 possibly, and so you're a representative of actually the emerging demographic, which is in my consideration more productive and actually representative of what the future is going to look like. However, I'm sure you are butting into resistance because the lens that they're looking at the 1 + 4 as opposed to the 5, or they've got mentors that are coming down from established institutions like AICD, where they try and perpetuate the past. So how do you go about, I'll make this a very pointed question, finding mentors, finding cultural mentors for leaders at the moment? I find it's very difficult because if they go to traditional means, they don't necessarily get the contemporary progressive view that you're speaking of, and to which I also agree.
Oh, that's a great question. One of the challenges I find for my demographic and the people who are in leadership now is you're looking to a model of leadership which was based on people who were the mentors of that group of people that you're talking about. So we're technically looking to kind of generations like before of their style of leadership, which was mentored. But then we have a kind of Gen Z, Gen Y, Gen Alpha coming through, which are driving a very different style of leadership. So we're looking to people for leadership advice for leading someone who is demanding something very different of us. So it's a really tricky spot to be in. But one of the things I often find is in every kind of mentoring relationship, I want to play 3 roles. I want to play the role of student, mentor, and teacher. Student being, how do I learn from this person? Mentor, how do I give to this person? And then teacher, how do I take and share with other people? And so when we're looking for mentors, I'm not looking to a mentor to just take from them. I'm going, hey, what can I do that could give back to you? And what also can I take from you to share with other people, and trying to find a more holistic picture to the mentoring relationship. So I want to be mentored by Gen Z. I need them to show me how do I best lead you, but I don't want to rely on their wisdom. I need to be able to give to them as well. But I also, at the same time, I don't want to rely on the wisdom of people who've gone before me and not give anything back to them as well. So you need to play all three of those roles, not just the recipient of mentoring.
Yeah, it's a great answer. Thank you. Really appreciate that. What a fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for being on the Inspirathon.